Let's get started. We all right, Kim? Oh, okay. All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start with a bill hearing on one bill. This is Senate Bill 1005, it's an emergency bill. It's one I think we've all are aware of, the state retirement pension system. We're divesting from Russia. Senator?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, here to present Senate Bill 1005. And I want to thank Ann Gothrop from the State Retirement and Pension System for being here to answer any of the tough questions, but I'm just going to give you the highlights of the bill and why this bill is so needed. The system, even though back in January the system had about 197 million worth of investments in Russia, that number is now down to about $7.5 million. And of that, the system has 2.7 million in assets that are actively managed by separate accounts, meaning the system has control over these assets. Also of the 7 million, about 230,000 is invested with OFAC sanctioned companies. So the value of the system's total exposure in Russia went from 197 million down to 7.5 million. Mostly due to the devaluation of those assets over the last 3 months. It's clear that Russia is no longer a reliable entity for our pension system to be invested in. And this bill is very similar to the 2008 legislation that directed the Board of Trustees to divest from certain companies whose shares were held in an actively managed but separate account. Just a reminder to the committee that those companies were doing business with Iran and Sudan. And it's actually that 2008 legislation that allowed for the system to act so quickly in this Russia situation. So without that, they would frankly still be holding on to a lot of bad assets. But they still need this bill in order to divest from the rest of our assets in Russia. And we recognize, I think that I can speak for the pension subcommittee, that this is a drastic measure, but also one that is incredibly needed when we have, number one, assets that are incredibly vulnerable at this time, and number two, assets tied up in a country that has created unprovoked aggression in a way that is threatening global security. So I will turn it over to Ann, Mr. Chair, if I may, to cover anything I didn't cover. But this bill, again, will give our system the kind of direction they need to ensure that Maryland's pension system is not investing in companies in Russia that are further adding to a global crisis. And I ask for a favorable report.
Thank you, Senator. And did, as the assets were diminishing in value, did the system start selling them?
Yes, we've been able to sell some. I don't have an exact amount for you as to what we've been able to sell and what is a reflection of devaluation. I can get that for you. It might take a little bit of time to tease that out.
Okay. Senator Zucker?
I could be wrong with my recollection, but from what I remember on the joint pensions hearing, they had seen the writing on the wall of the state of Maryland. They started divesting at that time.
That's right.
Yes.
And so they did the best they could under the circumstances, it sounded like.
Yes.
And I would say, Mr. Chairman, I see some lights, but I'll wait till after the questions are answered. Thank you.
All right. Senator Ackert?
Thank you very much.
You don't need to do anything.
No.
That?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'm sorry, tell me again the amount that the difference has been from the time we started, what the total amount was that we had invested, and then what we started to do and where we are now.
So as of January 31st, we had 197 million invested. Today, maybe yesterday, we had 7.5 million.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Rosapep?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two questions. One is, from the amount we had like 3 weeks ago, how much of the decline in value is because of declining value of stock as opposed to sale of stock?
So I don't know that exactly, but I can get that answer for you. It would require our investment team to tease it out
Yeah,
and figure out what was.
if you would do that, the difference would be helpful. That's number one. I say three quick questions. That was one. Second one is, what are the current holdings in Russia-related equities?
7.5 million.
Yeah, what is it? What are they held in? That's
Oh,
I'm
what
asking.
are they held in?
Oh, well, we have, I know we have equity and we have bonds.
Okay, but I mean specifically.
Like the companies?
Yeah.
I can let you know that. I
Yeah,
don't have a
that-
list of the companies.
The list of the companies, the list, yeah, the specifics of what's still there.
Yes.
Third question is, Senator, you said that the 2008 law was helpful with the divestiture that's happened already.
Yes.
So what was it about that law that made that helpful, and what was helpful about this additional bill? What's the difference between 2008 bill and this bill?
Ann, would you mind?
Not at all. So, Senator, the 2008 bill was the first divestment bill the system has seen. In working with that bill, recently, we found one of the companies that we divested from one of the companies that was on the Iran-Sudan list for divestment. That company also held assets in Russia.
Sure.
So ahead, and to Senator Zucker's point, ahead of the whole invasion, we divested from that company, and I think we ended up being able to sell $10 or $15 million as a result of that, ahead of everything crashing.
Oh, but that was only because it was targeted at companies in Iran and Sudan that also happened to be in Russia.
That's right. But this bill is modeled off of that.
So really, all this bill does is it takes the same framework that was applied to Sudan and Iran and applies it to Russia.
That's right.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Young?
Thank you. I think I'm getting the answer reading it here, but this also means we're going to divest from any American company that's doing business there?
Yes.
So, like, I know McDonald's and Starbucks pulled out, but some companies haven't, so we would divest of them.
If we have direct control over those, we're only divesting from actively managed assets that we have direct control over. So if there are some investments that are in, for instance, a mutual fund, where we don't have control, we can't, it's up to the manager to be able to do
It's
that.
just like if we had McDonald's stock, we would divest of that.
If we directly held that, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Senator, just to add on to that, I think this is very much also about a market pressure to others and a signaling that Maryland is making this important policy decision. I think that's also going to influence the companies maybe we don't have direct control over, but it's an indication that they should be jumping this as well.
That's why I was asking.
Yep.
We should do that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, page 4. On the other day on the climate bill, we heard discussion about what happens to also be Section G.
Yes.
I'd like, Ann, if you could explain the nature of the need for this and
Sure.
and the legal, if you can give us the legal background that I would assume contradicts maybe the legal opinion that we heard from our esteemed colleague.
So, bear with me, it's been a while since I practiced law. G and H, so lines 13 through 21 on page 4, they go together. And really, the way I like to look at this, I look at H first. Without H, you don't get to G. So H talks about we have to act consistent in a good faith manner. We have our board, anyone associated with the system, the fiduciaries associated with the system have fiduciary standards of loyalty and care to the system. If they breach those duties, they're not acting in good faith. And so what this bill says is, well, why we need this in this bill is we have this general provision, and I've always thought, wow, this is redundant. We already have this in the law. Why do we need this here again? With the 2008 legislation, the Attorney General came out and said, divestment is, by its nature, would not be necessarily acting in good faith. But we understand these are extenuating circumstances with the 2008 legislation. So we want you to put in specific provisions in the law that say you have to act in good faith. And if you act in good faith, you'll be okay. There are no liability protections in the law right now for our fiduciaries of the system. So if they are acting in good faith for divestment, we also want to make sure that they are protected from liability for those actions.
Okay? Everybody got it? All right. Very good.
Thank you.
Any questions anymore? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Is there,
Chairman?
yes,
Move favorable.
all those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Very good, thank you. Okay. We are going to move right into our reporting out. We're going to start with health, go to public safety, and then education.
Save the best to last. And I have a lot of questions on health.
Well, there's no rush for the color pages that used to be. I'm actually surprised there aren't more people here, though. It's interesting.
The beauty of the internet.
Right. Okay, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chair, colleagues. It's my pleasure to present the report of the Subcommittee on Health and Human Services. First, before I get started, I want to thank the members of the subcommittee, beginning with Senator Addie Eckert, Senator Jim Rosapep, and Senator Ron Young. I also want to thank and shout out our committee staff, Philip Anthony, who's done a phenomenal job keeping us all straight this session. We extend a special thank you to our budget analysts. They are Andrew Garrison, Emily Haskell, Madeline Miller, Kelly Norton, Grace Pedersen, who's sitting with me, Samuel Quest, Morgan Smith, Ann Wagner, Caleb Weiss, and Tanya Zimmerman. And I would also like to thank Hugh Norco, who edited this report. Turning to the subcommittee's actions, which start on page 2 with the Department of Disabilities, the subcommittee adopted narrative pertaining to the Universal Services Trust Fund. On page 3, for the Governor's Office of Small Minority and Women Business Affairs, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on training and outreach data. The subcommittee also adopted narrative requesting agency minority business enterprise participation and liaison surveys. Also on page 3, for the State Commission on Criminal Sentencing Policy, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on the evaluation of racial bias in sentencing. Starting on page 5, the Department of Aging, the subcommittee adopted 2 pieces of narrative requesting data on wait lists and utilization of several programs. On page 7, for the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on pending and open cases and investigator staffing. On page 8 and 9 of the report, the Maryland Institute of Emergency Medical Services Systems, the subcommittee added language restricting funds pending a report on interfacility hospital transportation and adopted narrative on EMT staffing shortages. On page 10, for the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange, the subcommittee adopted two pieces of narrative. The first requires notification of submission of state innovation waivers, and the second on the reinsurance program forecast. On page 11, for the State Department of Assessment and Taxation, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on the continued real property valuation staffing vacancies, and another piece of narrative requesting a report on the decline in eligible applicants for the homeowners and renters tax credits. On page 12, for the Property Tax Assessment Appeals Boards, the subcommittee restricted funds pending a report on a plan to address the appeals backlog in one county. Turning to the Maryland Department of Health, starting on page 13, with administration, the subcommittee added two pieces of language which continue to page 14. The first requires a report on MDH staffing, including how staff will be aligned under the new facilities master plan. The second requires reporting on MDH's ability to meet legislative mandates for court-involved admissions. Beginning on page 15, the subcommittee also adopted narrative on creating uniform patient and staff safety measures at MDH facilities. In the Office of Healthcare Quality on page 16, the subcommittee adopted narrative to survey flu vaccination policies at Maryland hospitals. Moving to the health professional boards and commissions, starting on page 17, the subcommittee restricted funds from the Board of Professional Counselors and Therapists and the Board of Pharmacists pending reports on efforts to address repeat audit findings. On page 18, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting the Board of Dental Examiners report on its performance relative to goals. The subcommittee also adopted narrative requesting a report from the boards on efforts to address a repeat audit finding. In addition, the subcommittee added narrative requesting an update on the board's licensing and regulatory management systems project. On page 19, the subcommittee restricted funds from the Board of Nursing on efforts to resolve a repeat audit finding. On page 20, Mr. Chairman, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on the impacts of the cybersecurity attack on the Health Occupations Board. Also on page 20, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report from the Board of Nursing on the timely processing of investigations. Moving to the Public Health Administration on pages 21 through 23, the subcommittee added two pieces of language restricting funds pending reports on accreditation and recruitment under the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner and vacancy rates among public health personnel. On page 24, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on higher education programs for forensic pathologists and other Office of Chief Medical Examiner staff. Moving to the Behavioral Health Administration, beginning on page 25, the subcommittee adopted language restricting funds in the Secretary's office pending a report on actual overpayments forgiven and how the department has determined the balance owed by providers. Turning to page 26, the subcommittee added language restricting funds pending a report on the state's pre-admission screening and resident review program prior to admission into nursing homes. On page 27, the subcommittee adopted narrative on the behavioral health crisis services. The subcommittee has reconsidered and is replacing that language with language on color page 1 that strengthens the reporting requirements on MDH for the evaluation of the state's behavioral health crisis response services and makes the Maryland Healthcare Commission the author instead of the Behavioral Health Administration. On page 28, the subcommittee added annual language and adopted two pieces of narrative, one on telebehavioral health and the other on medication-assisted treatment. On page 29, the subcommittee restricted the use of fiscal 2022 ASO deficiency appropriation and added language. Moving to the Developmental Disabilities Administration on page 31, the subcommittee restricted funds pending a report on finalized rates and spending forecasts. On page 32, the subcommittee restricted funds provided for DDA community services to that purpose. Also on page 32 and on to 33, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting quarterly reports on community service utilization data. Moving to Medicaid, beginning on page 34 and continuing to page 36, the subcommittee added 2 pieces of language restricting funds pending reports on determinations following the end of the COVID-19 public health emergency and current Medicaid rates and rate-setting activities. On pages 36 and 37, the subcommittee added annual language and 2 pieces of narrative requesting reports on the MCO risk corridor settlements and Community First Choice financial and registry data. On pages 38 and 39, the subcommittee deleted double-budgeted federal funds provided in 2 deficiencies and added language under the Maryland Children's Health Program. On the bottom of page 39 and continuing to page 40, pertaining to Medicaid behavioral health, the subcommittee added annual language, restricted the uses for fiscal 2022 ASO deficiency appropriation, and deleted double-budgeted funds. In the Health Regulatory Commissions on page 41, the subcommittee adopted narrative to review the state's healthcare financing models response to the COVID-19 pandemic and requested continued evaluation of the Maryland Primary Care Program. Turning to the Department of Human Services on page 42, the subcommittee restricted general funds for the Maryland Legal Services Program to be used only for that purpose. In the Social Services Administration on page 43, the subcommittee restricted funds pending a report from the Office of Legislative Audits indicating corrective action has been taken to the agency's audit findings. Starting on page 44 through 45, the subcommittee adopted 3 pieces of narrative requesting reports on hospital stays for foster youth in out-of-home placements, the status of implementation of the Family First Prevention Services Act, and the status of implementing a new rate structure for foster care providers. In the Operations Office on page 46, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting information on the department's recruitment efforts. On page 47, in the Office of Technology for Human Services, the subcommittee requested a report on data reporting capabilities available through MD Think. In local department operations on page 48, the subcommittee adopted language restricting funding for foster care maintenance payments and child welfare services to that purpose. Starting on pages 48 through 50, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting annual data on caseload to staffing ratios for child welfare services caseworker positions. Also on page 50, the subcommittee added narrative requesting a report examining the impacts of economic instability caused by the COVID-19 pandemic on child neglect and maltreatment reporting. On page 51 and continuing on to page 52, the subcommittee adopted 3 pieces of committee narrative requesting quarterly reports on application processing times, denial rates, and the reasons for case closure for public benefits programs, 2 reports on children served and participation rates through the summer SNAP, and spending for the pandemic EBT program to be identified separately in budget materials. On page 53, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on the ongoing benefit cliff initiative for those exiting temporary cash assistance and job retention bonuses in the TCA program. On page 54, in the Child Support Administration, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting data on enforcement actions and performance. On page 56, in the Family Investment Administration, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on planned changes to the educational and experience requirements for family investment specialist positions. On pages 57 and 58, in the Office of Home Energy Programs, the subcommittee adopted 3 pieces of narrative requesting the department submit reports on energy assistance application processing times and denial rates, the status of implementation of categorical eligibility for determination of energy assistance benefits, and the usage of federal funds for the establishment of the Low-Income Household Water Assistance Program. The subcommittee also has one additional item, shown on color page 2, that adds narrative in the Maryland Department of Health Prevention and Health Promotion Administration, requesting a report on cost of mobile COVID-19 vaccination clinics and missions. I move the adoption of the subcommittee report as amended, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Questions for the subcommittee chair? Okay. All those in favor of this report?
Aye.
Opposed? Well done. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone.
Public safety.
You ready, Mr. Chair?
Absolutely.
First, just want to take the time out and thank the members of the subcommittee. I'm going to start with the 1st Legislative District, our friend from Mountain, Maryland, Senator George Edwards, the veteran of the committee. Also like to thank the 27th Legislative District, Senator Michael Jackson, and our 6th Legislative District, Senator Johnny Ray Sailing. I'd also like to take this time out to thank my wingman, Matt Bennett, and our staff, Brett Ogden, who edited this document. Finally, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank DLS. I think that we all know the wonders that DLS does, but most importantly, I've got the first opportunity to work very, very closely with Jacob Cash, Andrew Garrison, Andrew Gray, Emily Haskell, Jason Kramer, Steve McCullough, Madeline Miller, Kelly Norton, Samuel Quist, Morgan Smith, and Caleb Weiss. Just want to send a special thank you out to them again because they've all taken phone calls and helped me to educate myself on a number of issues within the budget as well as the subcommittee. We will begin on page 1 with the judiciary, where the subcommittee reduced excess funds for judicial compensation enhancements and adopted 2 pieces of requested narrative dealing with reports on the appointed attorney program and judgeships needs. On page 2 and page 3, colleagues, the subcommittee restricted funds for the implementation of the DeWolf versus Richmond and added funds for the Access to Counsel and Evictions program. The subcommittee also restricted funds pending a report on court performance measures and requested quarterly reports on the Access to Counsel and Eviction programs. On page 4 and 5, the subcommittee reduced excess funds for circuit court clerk salaries and restricted funds to increase circuit court clerk salaries pending the passage of legislation. The subcommittee also requested a report on vacant properties and requested a report on major IT development projects. On page 6, the Office of the Public Defender, the subcommittee requested a report on the attorney applicant hiring and separations and requested a report on the IT security. On page 7, the Office of Attorney General, the subcommittee requested a report on the Independent Investigations Division and requested a report on vacancies. On page 8, in the Public Service Commission, the subcommittee requested a report on complaints filed against utilities and requested a report on marketing practices of retail energy suppliers. On page 9, in the Uninsured Employers Fund, the subcommittee restricted funds pending a report on correction of audit findings. On page 10 and 11, the Maryland Energy Administration, the subcommittee requested reports on the Strategic Energy Investment Fund and Maryland Gas Expansion Fund. We will now turn to the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services. On pages 12 through 16, the subcommittee restricted funds for 2 reports on new managing for results performance measures and added language that specifies how Victims of Crime Act, we know as VOCA funding, shall be awarded and requires 2 reports on the VOCA funding grant program. The subcommittee has also requested an update on the implementing recommendations from the DLS Office of Program Evaluation and Government Accountability. On page 18 and 19, on page 17, the subcommittee restricted law enforcement grants, funding for Baltimore City Police Department pending a report on warrants related to violation of probation. On page 18 and 19, the subcommittee restricted state aid for police protection funding so that it is distributed based on violent crime offenses, required a report on equitable policing in Baltimore County, and requested that county levy data be submitted for state aid for police protection in future budget books. On page 20, in the Department of Planning, the subcommittee requested a report on Maryland 250 commission funding. On page 21 and 22, in the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, the subcommittee requested new performance measures be submitted for the Maryland 911 Board and requested that county-level data be submitted for 911 revenues in future budget books. On page 23, in the Department of Veteran Affairs, the subcommittee restricted grant funding that provides revenue support to the contract of Charlotte Hall Veterans Home pending a report on the home's COVID-19 response. On page 24 and 25, in the Comptroller of Maryland, the subcommittee requested 3 reports on major IT development projects, a newborn savings account study, and a compliance with the National Incident-Based Reporting System, NERVS. On page 26 and 27, in the Maryland Department of Transportation, the subcommittee added annual language requiring notification of changes to the capital program and establishing a position cap for the department. On page 28 and 29, the Secretary's Office, the subcommittee added language restricting operating grants and aid to the amount submitted in the budget and requiring notification of changes to the capital program. On page 30 through 32, in the MDOT debt service requirements, the subcommittee added 3 pieces of annual language establishing debt limits for traditional and non-traditional debt and requiring a report on non-traditional debt issuances. On page 33, in Motor Vehicle Administration, the subcommittee requested a report on privacy concerns for digital driver's licenses. On page 34 through 36, in the Maryland Transit Administration, the subcommittee added 3 pieces of language restricting funds pending reports on paratransit policies and procedures related to late ride pickups, hiring and retention efforts for hard-to-fill positions, and cellular broadband availability in transit station and along transit alignments. The subcommittee also adopted narrative expressing intent that the Maryland Transit Administration provide technical assistance to Baltimore area colleges and universities in their effort to connect each campus with a unified transit line. On page 37, in the Maryland Aviation Administration, the subcommittee restricted special funds pending a report on the airport noise zone. On page 38, in the Maryland Transportation Authority, the subcommittee requested a report on tolling issues. On page 39 and 40, in the Department of Natural Resources, the subcommittee restricted funds until a submission of a plan to rebuild Swallow Falls Bridge and the submission of the 2010 Trust Fund Annual Work and Expenditure Plans. The subcommittee also adopted narrative on Chesapeake Bay program spending by program. We will now turn to the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. On page 41 through 43, the subcommittee restricted funding for the purpose of increasing employment within 2 administrative units and restricted funding pending a report on recovering unsupported payments made to the inmate medical contractor. The subcommittee also requested reports on Justice Reinvestment Act costs, savings, recidivism, and contraband. On page 44 and 45, the subcommittee restricted funds pending quarterly hiring and attrition reports and restricted funds to plan a pre-release facility for our women. On pages 46 and 47, the subcommittee restricted funds pending a report on those victimized while on community supervision and requested a report on caseload ratios. On page 48 and 49, the subcommittee restricted the funding for substance use or disorder treatment subprograms and adopted narrative, requesting a report on inmate behavioral health care. Moving to the Maryland Department of the Environment, on pages 50 and 51, the subcommittee adopted narrative on the reduction of state building operating costs and greenhouse gas emissions through district energy. The subcommittee also restricted funding until personnel expenditures are budgeted correctly. On page 52, in the Maryland Environmental Service, the subcommittee requested a funding statement report. On page 53 and 54, in the Department of Juvenile Services, the subcommittee requested performance measures for educational outcomes and restricted funds for a report on the Baltimore City Strategic Partnership. On pages 55 and 57, in the Department of State Police, the subcommittee's restricted new helicopter maintenance funding that was added in the supplemental budget number 1 and requested a report on the implementation of a workforce diversity action plan. On page 58 and 59, the subcommittee restricted funding until the submission of a report on the Chesapeake Bay restoration historical and projected spending. On page 60 through 63, the subcommittee restricted funds pending the report on out-of-home placements, the 2021 Uniform Crime Report, and youth-centered behavioral health intervention and prevention programs. Mr. Chair, finally, the subcommittee would like to add committee narrative requesting a report on reimbursements for forensics services for sexual abuse and sexual assault evaluation. That concludes the subcommittee's actions, Mr. Chair, on the fiscal 2023 budget. Motion to move the subcommittee report as amended.
Any questions? All those, yes?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If the committee would beg my indulgence and separate the Office of the Comptroller so I could take the rule on that and vote on the rest of the public safety transportation budget. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, on the report minus the comptroller section, all those in favor? Aye. Opposed? On the comptroller section, all those in favor?
Aye.
Senator Zucker
Thank you
takes the
all.
roll. Well done, thank you.
Appreciate you, Jake.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'd like to start off with thanking the members of the subcommittee, Senator Paul Quarterman, Senator Sarah Elfreth, and Senator Craig Zucker, and to also thank our great committee staff, Erica Schisler, and the budget analysts, Sarah Baker, Patrick Frank, Andrew Gray, Emily Haskell, Laura Hyde, Ian Klein, Samuel Quist, Morgan Smith, Ann Wagner, and Caleb Weiss. And also Madeline Ross, who edited this document. Beginning with the Board of Public Works on page 1, the subcommittee adopted 2 pieces of narrative requesting reports on financial and attendance data from the Maryland Zoo and the status of making the Justice Thurgood Marshall's former school a national park. For the Historic St. Mary's City Commission on page 2, the subcommittee adopted language restricting funds pending a performance audit on the financial management practices of the commission. In the Department of Information Technology, on pages 3 through 5, the subcommittee adopted 6 pieces of narrative requesting reports on developing managing for results indicators for services to state agencies, spending cybersecurity funds in the dedicated purpose account, an update on the remote workforce enablement major information technology development project, plans to spend federal infrastructure investment and Jobs Act funds, a standard pricing schedule for Maryland Public Television towers, and the new State Chief Data Officer and State Chief Privacy Officer. For the Department of General Services on page 6, subcommittee adopted language restricting funds to be used to support managing facilities maintenance, and also adopted language restricting funds pending a report on State Center. On the subcommittee adopted 2 pieces of language requesting reports on emergency procurements and managing for results goals and indicators for employee training. On page 9, for the Maryland Department of Labor, the subcommittee adopted language restricting funds pending a report on the Providing Our Workers Education and Readiness Apprenticeship Act. On page 10, the subcommittee adopted language restricting a portion of workforce development funding for oversight purposes. And finally, we'll distribute a colored page on apprenticeships and ask that the budget analyst, Emily, describe it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This piece of narrative does a couple things. First, it asks the Department of Labor to establish 3 different work groups, one for public safety, one for healthcare, and one for transportation. And for each of these work groups, they will look at vacancy data and also make recommendations relating to potential apprenticeship opportunities in those areas. Each work group will submit an interim and final report. And then also on the back, the last paragraph, you can see the narrative also requests that the University System of Maryland work with several groups, including the Department of Labor, to submit a report related to the possibility of creating degree apprenticeship programs.
Thank you. Turning to the Maryland State Department of Education on pages 11 through 17, the subcommittee adopted 10 pieces of narrative requesting reports on accounting practices, state education agency federal stimulus funds, virtual learning, the Maryland School for the Deaf, personnel and vacancies, the Maryland Comprehensive Assessment Program, child care stabilization grant allocations and processing times, the Early Childhood Data System Modernization Project, and environmental literacy standards. On pages 18 and 19 for the Maryland State Department of Education, Aid to Education, the subcommittee adopted 2 pieces of language restricting funds pending a report on maintenance of effort calculations and the autism wait list. Also on pages 19 through 22, the subcommittee adopted 4 pieces of narrative requesting reports on the non-public placement program, an update on the Pathways in Technology Early College High School program, Child Care Scholarship Program enrollment, and funding adequacy in the Child Care Scholarship Program. On page 23, for the Maryland State Department of Education, funding for education organizations, subcommittee adopted language modifying the distribution of funding for the Aid to Non-Public Schools program and adopted narrative requesting a report on the federal funding for non-public schools. On page 25, for the Interagency Commission on School Construction, committee adopted language restricting funds pending a report on the statewide facilities assessment. On page 26, the subcommittee adopted intent language that funds be used for public and non-public schools. On page 27, the subcommittee adopted language restricting funds pending a report on charter and contract schools. On page 28, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on public and non-public school safety grants. On page 29, for the Accountability and Implementation Board, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on managing for results measures. On page 30, for the University of Maryland Baltimore campus, the subcommittee adopted language restricting funds for a grant. On page 31, for Bowie State University, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting an update on its nursing program. For Frostburg State University, on page 32, the subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on increasing the capacity of its physician assistant program. On page 33, for the Maryland Higher Education Commission, subcommittee adopted language restricting funds pending the status on corrective actions related to a recent audit. Also on this page, and continuing on to the next page, the subcommittee adopted language restricting funds pending a report on the progress toward the 55% completion goal. On pages 34 through 37, the subcommittee adopted 5 pieces of narrative requesting reports on financial aid by expected family contribution, awarding credit for prior learning, independent institutions' support of the state's higher education goals, impact of credit completion requirement on financial aid, and post-secondary outcomes for next-generation scholars. Also, for the Student Financial Assistance Office of the Maryland Higher Education Commission, the subcommittee agreed to a color page that states the intent of the General Assembly that the Veterans of the Afghan and Iraq Conflicts Scholarship be renamed to include a recognition of Senator Douglas J.J. Peters. On page 38 for higher education, the first item is technical and reflects actions previously taken by the subcommittee. The subcommittee also adopted narrative requesting faculty workloads reports. For Baltimore City Community College, on page 39 through 40, the subcommittee adopted 3 pieces of narrative requesting reports on the realignment plan, information technology infrastructure plan, and enrollment and the mayor's scholarship program. On page 41, for the Department of Commerce, the subcommittee adopted 2 pieces of narrative requesting reports on the Small Minority and Women-Owned Business Account and the More Jobs for Marylanders program. The subcommittee adopted language restricting funds for a grant to the Downtown Partnership of Baltimore. However, the subcommittee has a color page to modify the language to increase the grant to $1 million and also restrict funds for an additional grant to Visit Baltimore. I move to adopt the report as amended.
Is there a second? Any questions? Okay. I'm sorry? Oh. A little late. You have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say I like that touch of the recognition for our senator that was here and worked with us and was a good friend, Douglas J.J. Peters. So I want to say thank you for that.
Very good.
Good touch.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, very good. You got it all done. Congratulations. So we'll keep working on the full report, and we'll be back, we plan to be back on Monday morning for that. We're still trying to figure out timing. Okay, with that, that concludes this portion of our day. We're going to move into a voting session. Thank you all. DLS staff all around, thank you. Yeah, we're going to take 5 minutes. Back out at 10 up. Okay, we're back. We're going to do a voting session just for everybody's time, so they know we're going to be done by 2:45. So
Long day.
you're welcome. You're welcome. So you can make it home in a reasonable time. All right. First up, 662.
Senate Bill 662 is a bill that was a JPR bill. B&T is secondary on it. JPR has voted on it, and it's up here now. This is the Access to Counsel and Eviction Special Fund. It's providing funding to the, there was a fund created last year called the Access to Counsel and Eviction Special Fund, and this would direct funding to that fund. It would be in fiscal '24, and as amended by JPR, the money from the yes, unclaimed property is going to be directed in fiscal '24. That'd be $14 million into this fund. And then this fund would be used to provide funding to the Maryland Legal Services Corporation to support the Access to Counsel and Evictions Fund. And so there are some amendments in the bill in front of you, and it basically accomplishes everything that I just described. There was some technical things that needed to get done regarding appropriating money out of the special fund once it gets in there, and then we had to back up on the termination date.
Senator.
Matt, do we know if there are other bills out there that are proposing to use this money from the unclaimed
I am
fund?
being told no.
None at all?
Senator Zucker.
Are you asking if there's any funds out there that it's going to take for the unclaimed property?
Yes.
Only those funds that are in existing statute that already pay out to legal services on past law. But nothing is, this is the only legislation in right now that would do that this session. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Yeah. I mean,
it's,
there's all the existing ones, nothing
Correct.
new, but there are a couple other
yeah,
things.
tell us what the other ones are. I just
So
thought
there's-
there was another bill out there.
There's $8 million that goes to the Maryland Legal Services Corporation Fund established under the Human Services article. I'd have to pull that statute to see what they use that funding for.
That's their basic funding for
That's
Maryland
their
Legal Services.
funding, right.
This is the Maryland Legal Services, but this is specifically geared to the eviction problem.
I don't have any problem with where it's going. I
No,
just
well,
wanted to make
no,
sure.
No, but there's two things going on here, because Maryland Legal Services needs their ongoing money for a whole host of things that they do, but this is not that. This is strictly for evictions. And then there are,
And then there are, yes, thank
There's
you.
some money that goes to the State Victims of Crime Fund established in the Criminal Procedure article.
That's where it is, the VOCA monies.
And then up until
Not-
last year, for fiscal '22 and fiscal '23, there was $250,000 that was going to the Tax Clinics for Low-Income Marylanders Fund. But that ends in fiscal '23.
Okay. Thank you, that's
So-
helpful.
Senator Quarterman.
Yeah, what was the vote in JPR?
Kim, do you have the vote record? Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll get that vote in a second.
Yeah.
Yes.
Those funds then are available to all the jurisdictions, or how, or do you know how those monies are distributed? and made
Sponsor the
available?
bill.
Senator Zucker?
Yeah, it would be available to whoever needs help with evictions, and it would apply to any jurisdiction.
Do they apply for it?
Yeah, I mean, they
Their
would go
help
through legal services, and legal services would provide
Okay.
the,
Okay,
but it's available
all
to,
right. We have a list in 2 of our counties.
got it. Well, then Senator, this is a good bill.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
If I might, also, Senator Eckert, while in JPR last year, we visited this. This also ensures that there is legal representation in the courthouses. So what happens is you get an eviction notice, or you get a late notice, and you go to the courthouse, and you're not prepared, the landlords are prepared. So this will ensure that there's legal folks in the courthouse.
There's nothing in CIS.
Yeah, yeah.
No, that's helpful. I'm on a work group locally, and these issues come up, so I want to be able, when I go on the call this week, to let them know that that's available, so that's helpful. Thank you.
We'll remember these tough questions you do, Corman. What's that?
Mike Huff said it was unanimous.
Thank you.
Okay. Unanimous?
Mike Huff.
Okay. Where'd he go? I guess we don't need to. Any other questions? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right. What's next up?
Kevin Maxwell's asking about this bill. I don't know why it's being held up.
I don't know.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily mean it's being held up. It
It just
says-
hasn't gotten to it yet, and this one is that maintenance of effort bill that we gotta get passed.
Okay. Okay, sorry for that. We're ready to get going again. What do we got next?
Sure. Thank you. So Senate Bill 760, you guys heard yesterday, or maybe the day before. It's about property tax exemption. This is the one deals with the religious groups or other third-party leases within a space that is otherwise exempt from property taxation. I think the reason why it's on the list is because there was some testimony about, from SDT, and I had some thoughts on how to potentially tighten it up, and the sponsor himself was gonna enter into some discussions with them as well, I believe, to look at how to tighten it up. Is that
Oh, so we're still
Yeah.
waiting on that?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, all right. I mean, it seemed like it was an interesting bill, an important bill that we should be talking about, but does anybody have any thoughts about it other than the fact that we may have a couple, I think, probably, hopefully just technical in a sense, amendments, maybe? You remember the bill? Yes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it made sense, and I think we'd fix it for technical problems, we should pass it.
Okay,
That's all.
okay, very good. All right, what else we got?
That's really what I have.
Do we have a couple more?
Yes, but I'm not ready on them because we just heard them this week, and they all need have issues.
Oh, wow,
Yeah.
okay. So, you got nothing else? Does he have any more? You didn't have any more? Yes. Okay.
Her bill? The agriculture.
Oh, yeah, I thought I put that up on there. Oh, is that, okay. All right.
Wait, which one?
Oh, I see. You're comfortable with it, the 200, okay. Yeah, okay, all right. All right, all right. You remember this bill from yesterday? Why don't you give it a second?
What's the bill number? I'm sorry. Oh, my
That,
shoulders.
it's
Okay.
yes, that,
A little disjointed.
567. Okay. Oh, yeah, okay.
Oh, that's why, yeah. Yeah, we, you ready?
Okay. Yep, so this is the one that was about, the agricultural assessment. And the testimony was that, SDAT was switching from an agricultural assessment to a commercial assessment for certain, structures, on farmland. So this bill with the reprint clarifies that these certain types of these buildings should remain to be assessed as agricultural things like alcohol production, agritourism, equine activities, any sort of value-added processes taking place on the property, roadside stands, as well as other local zoning issues. What it then does is say that what isn't required to be agricultural use assessment is renting a facility for private event with a capacity of greater than 200 individuals, or anything that the local zoning may indicate. And it makes it an emergency bill.
Okay. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Great. All right. Yeah, we can do this.
Okay. Okay. Senate Bill 383 is the next one. This is Bill, a couple of years ago, a grant was established for the Maryland Association of Environmental and Outdoor Education Programs, and the grant was established for a certain number of years. This bill comes in and extends that grant for 2 additional years for various entities.
Same funding levels?
So, yes, the funding levels, yep, so current law, the highest funding level would have been for fiscal '25, $141,600. It retains that funding level for '26 and for '27. There's about 5 or 6 different little grants in here. So, yep, it retains that. Yeah, none of the funding levels are increased, they're just extended.
And what is it, fundamentally, what kinds of things do they do?
An outdoor ed program.
Yeah, it's outdoor ed, so the funding, the grants allow them to increase the number of green schools in Maryland is one portion of it. Another portion of it is to assist with transportation of students to and from these environmental type programs. as well, and to increase the number of environmental educators in the state, to support statewide green school events, an annual evaluation, and to create an online form to get funding to apply, and that's it.
Okay, lots of little stuff. Okay,
By fiscal '27, yes. The first year of the cost would be in fiscal '26, because that's the first year of the extension, at $64,000.
okay.
Move favorable.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay. And that really may be it, so we really are gonna end early. You have your lives back for a little while. Anything else anybody's got? Want to bring up? We don't know yet.
Okay.
Sorry. I mean,
What do you think we will know? Monday morning?
hopefully by the end of the day.
Okay, good.
I have everybody's cell phone, so, one way or another, we'll make sure we contact you as soon as we know.
But we still should think about keeping the morning free for the time being.
Yes, keep the morning free. Please.
Tax Subcommittee, only because,
Actually, we can probably go off, right? I think we're done.
All right.